Hello everybody and welcome to another Databases SQL video. And today we're going to be talking about how to ensure that your database structure is sound. What that means is we need to make sure that your database makes sense, in simple words. We need to make sure that anybody who works at your company who comes in to work on your database, that they know what that database stands for, what it represents, what kind of data it stores. So just in general, I will show you some tips and tricks on how to make sure that your database makes sense. Let's start. Now, why would you worry about that? Why would you try to make your database sound? And just in general, why to worry about this? Well, first of all, you will have many different problems if your database does not make sense. First of all, if you need to retrieve some simple information from your database, that can become a hard task if you design your database poorly. Other things such as data integrity, what that means that your data might be corrupted, your data might not be accurate if you design your database poorly. Your tables might not relate to each other in the way that they're supposed to if you design it poorly. And just as I said, retrieve accurate information. That might be a problem when it comes to a poorly designed database. Again, think of it as a program. You are familiar with writing programs, and remember the first thing that we learned in our PLD 101 course is that coding is not the first thing that you do when it comes to your program. What is the first thing that you do? You are designing your program. This is the very crucial step when it comes to coding. You will design your program before you touch your keyboard to type any sort of code. So you will make sure that your program is performing how it's supposed to be, that you are covering all of the tasks that are asked of your program, and you will make sure that you will be coding it in a way that you're supposed to, and your program will work in a way that it's supposed to. The same idea comes to a database. You will design your database before you put any sort of data into it. And before you even create it, you will have to design it properly. First thing we're going to talk about is naming your columns. Again, this is the same idea as naming your variables. Now, databases and working with the databases, in my opinion, it is very similar to writing a program. Same idea, you need to make sure that your variables make sense, right, when you're writing a program. So you need to make sure that your columns also make sense and that they're not ambiguous. That's another big thing when it comes to databases. Your columns cannot be ambiguous. One example is if you need to store somebody's phone number, right? You cannot just put a name for your column as phone number because it is ambiguous. Is it a home number? Is it a work phone? Is it a cellular phone? What if somebody doesn't have a phone? What would you do in that case? So you have to make sure that your column name is clear and unambiguous. You might have to create multiple columns. For example, as for this phone number, you might have to create 3 different columns: a home phone, work phone, or a cellular phone. And based on what the user inputs, you will put that information in the specific column. So that's another thing that you have to pay attention to, is you have to be specific when it comes to the creation of your database. Another thing to note when it comes to your column names, do not use any acronyms or abbreviations. Just get that out of your head and make sure that you are as specific as you can be when it comes to the creation of your database. If you are using abbreviations, try to see if you can get rid of them. If you can just put the whole name, it doesn't matter how long it's going to be. Just make sure that if it's possible, try to put the full name instead of the abbreviation. Another thing is, do you have a column that's going to store 2 or more things, such as, for example, area or location, or phone or fax? If you have a column that is supposed to store 2 or more things, if you give your user a choice to put one or the other thing, you have to have 2 columns for that, 2 or more columns. Same idea as with the phone number. right? Instead of just putting phone number, I told you to put 3 different columns: home phone, work phone, cell phone. Same idea here. If you want to put one column that's going to store 2 or more types of information for you, just separate that column into smaller columns. It doesn't matter how big your database is at this point, because we are just learning how to create proper databases. In this case, you have to be as descriptive as you can be. Now let's look at these 2 columns right here. We have a column for staff, we have a table for staff, and we have a table for classes. Now, do you see anything that is similar in these 2 tables? There's a couple of columns that are similar. You can pause this video and figure it out for yourself. I'll give you some time to do that. But yes, there are similarities in these 2 tables. First of all, staff ID, right? Staff ID here, staff ID here. Then the other thing is staff first name, staff last name, staff last name, staff first name. Now these 2 tables, they are not supposed to be in this table. These 2 columns, staff last name and staff first name, they are unnecessary in this table classes. And you might be wondering why. I just told you to be as descriptive as you can be, but that doesn't mean that you need to duplicate your columns, because we already have a column right here that represents first name and the last name of our staff. We do not have to repeat them because we have this column staff ID right here. We can link these 2 tables together based on the staff ID. So for example, if you want to find, if you know that your staff ID is 98014 and you want to find their first and last name, you can just link these 2 tables together and look up this information that is doubled in the classes table. You can look it up in your staff table, because the staff IDs are the same and these 2 tables are linked to each other based on the staff ID. So that's another thing when it comes to designing your databases. Just make sure that your tables are linked just by 1 or 2 at max, 1 or 2 unique keys. So staff ID will be a foreign key for the classes table, but also staff ID is going to be the primary key for the staff table, because the staff ID will tell us which staff we have in our table. And what that means is each one of these people, they will have a unique staff ID assigned to them. Because remember, what is a primary key? Primary key is a column that cannot contain any duplicate values. So you can make sure that these IDs are unique and they are not duplicated in your table. So in this way, we can just delete these 2 columns right here, save us some space, save us some memory, make our database run quicker. And we just have to link them based on the staff IDs, and that's it. Now, the same idea comes to designing your tables. So we just covered how to design our columns, but the same idea comes to designing your tables too. A table should represent a single subject. If your table represents more than one subject, you may want to separate those tables into 2 or more different tables, because again, we don't want any ambiguity. We don't want any vague values in our tables. So it's better to separate them if your table represents more than one subject. Now, there's a couple of questions you can ask yourself before you create your table. First one, is the name unique and descriptive enough to be meaningful to your entire organization? What that means, you won't be the only person working on the database. You will probably have some other people looking at the database, retrieving data from a database, and stuff like that. So if you are responsible for designing that database, make sure that that name is unique and descriptive, so that anybody else who works on that database will know what that table is, which type of objects that table is storing, and what kind of data you can retrieve from that table. Another one is, does the name accurately, clearly, and unambiguously identify the subject of the table? Again, it's very important to make sure that the table represents exactly what is being stored inside of it. Just be accurate with your name. Be very clear what that name is, what that table is supposed to store. And for example, if you have employees, right? If you have employees table, you can just call it employees. That will tell anybody, if they see it, that will be a sign that this table is storing some sort of information about your employees. Now, if you want to store employees' salaries, for example, or employees' work years on the job, now that might be a different table. If you want to store just employees' basic information, you can just put the name as employees underscore information or employees underscore contact information, depending on what your table needs to store. Again, same idea. If you used any acronyms or abbreviations as your table name, change that. We do not want any acronyms or any abbreviations, because some people might not know what one acronym for you means. One acronym for you does not mean that the other person will look at it and think of it the same way. And another example is SC. For example, you have a table named SC. Now that can mean security codes, that can mean system configurations, that can mean steering committees. It doesn't matter. It can mean a lot of different things. So you have to be clear on what is being stored. Again, another important thing, I keep repeating it because it's very important when it comes to databases. You have to be clear with what type of information is being stored inside of your database as inside of your tables. Now that we've talked about the names and how to use them properly in our tables and our columns, let's focus on the last couple of things that we need to ensure that are present in our tables and in our database. So, first of all, make sure your table represents a single subject. I cannot stress this enough. One of the most important things. Make sure that your table represents a single thing, not two, not three, just one single subject. Then the next thing, make sure your table has a primary key. Again, a primary key is a unique value, a value that cannot be duplicated, such as an ID, such as employee ID, customer ID, some sort of information that will identify each one of the rows and that will let you ensure that you can tie that information to a different table. So it has to be unique. Make sure each one of the tables has at least one primary key. Make sure your table does not contain any multi-part or multi-valued columns. What that means is if your column has 1, 2, or 3 or more values listed, for example, you look at your column and you see that some of the values that are listed are separated by a comma. You do not want that in your table. You want your column to represent just one single value. So if you look at your table and you see that one of the columns has multiple values in it, that's a no-go. We do not want that. Just separate those values into either more columns or see if you can create a separate table for that specific column, if possible. Again, very simple. So if you see values separated by a comma, that's a no-go. Just get rid of them somehow. Make sure there are no calculated columns in the table. That means just if you have a column that is calculating some sort of value for you, do not do that. You just want straight facts. You do not want your data to be corrupted when it comes to calculations because, again, some calculations can go wrong and we do not want that. Make sure that a table is free of any unnecessary duplicate columns. I showed you an example with names, first name and last name. Those first and last name can be omitted because they already exist in a separate table, and we can link those two tables by a primary and a foreign key. So again, this is the last step. Look at your table, make sure that there is no unnecessary duplicate columns. Now, this is pretty much it for how to design your database. This will give you a solid ground when it comes to making your first database. Just make sure that you follow all of these steps that we have covered in this video, and you will be good to go. Again, if you will have to create a more complicated database, we will cover that later. However, just for your first database, when it comes to creating your first database and starting out with the databases, these steps are enough for you to create your own first database full of rows and columns and tables and whatever you want to put in the database, as long as you follow the rules that we have covered. Again, if you have any questions, reach out to me by email. I will reply to you. I can cover any of the topics more in depth if you need more information. But that is it for this video, and I will see you in the next one.